So I did want to talk about this billboard. This is an electronic billboard that Steven Rosenberg, who is a journalist for the BBC, who does, I think, some interesting journalism within Russia. I know a lot of people don't like the idea of people doing journalism in Russia, period, but I think there's a place for it with the war. I think some people get a little over-eager when it comes to trying to cover the war and or cover anything in Russia. As in, oh, it's impossible to do any good journalism within Russia right now. I think it's very difficult, and there's certain types of journalism that you just can't do in Russia and is impossible to do. But I do think there's a usefulness for Westerners to be able to document stuff like this and show us what the Russian government is preparing the Russian public for. There's a usefulness in that. So I might not agree with everything that all these journalists in Russia have to say, but I do think that there's at least a usefulness in having this perspective in there so we can peer into Russian society, especially if we're trying to, make decisions about, ceasefires, non-ceasefire, stuff like that. This is important information to know. But this poster, this electronic billboard that is up, that Steve Rosenberg saw on his way to work, says, Russia's borders do not end anywhere. Russia's borders do not end anywhere. Or to put it more simply, Russia can bring Russia anywhere. As in, maybe the borders of Russia end here, or maybe they end inside of all of Ukraine. Maybe they end here. Maybe they end with all of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. This calculus, this sentence right here, is a recipe for eternal war, eternal conflict. If you believe that your nation's borders do not end anywhere, then that means you could justify your nation going into anywhere and conquering anywhere and claiming it for your own. Principally, this is, in the purest sense of the word, a base level justification of imperialism and, in the most basic sense, the ideological foundation for empire building. And I'm not just saying that off the cuff of my wrist, and I'm just saying that because, I don't like the Russians, or, I'm over-exaggerating. This is what American, Italian, French, and other philosophers have talked about for a long time. In fact, let me cite two, Michael Hardit and Antonio Negri. These are two, Michael Hardit is American, Antonio is Italian. These are two philosophers that talked about this very concept, that talked about empire, and talked about empire quite a lot. And one way they talked about it, let me try to find it. Empire. Let me see if I can find it here. Oh, here it is. Danabo will have to edit this. We should emphasize that the use of empire here, not as a metaphor, which would require a demonstration of the resemblance between today's world order and the empires of Rome, China, the Americas, and so forth, but rather as a concept, which calls primarily for a theoretical approach. The concept, listen to this, the concept of empire is characterized fundamentally by a lack of boundaries. Empire's rule has no limits. First and foremost, then, the concept of empire posts a regime that effectively encompasses the totality, or really, that rules over the entire civilized world. No territorial boundaries limit its reign. Fundamentally, the foundation for an empire is the belief that your borders do not end with you, and they don't end anywhere, and you can go anywhere and take anything, as long as the empire demands it, as long as the empire needs it, as long as it is for the interests of the empire, or in this instance, if we're talking about Russian imperialism, for the interests of the Russian idea, this stage in a civilizational struggle with the West as they try to beat back the degeneracy, the liberal nonsense, these democratic norms and values, beat them back and replace them with their own idea of empire and their own ideology, which is quite, to put it frank, reactionary. It's very much trying to step backwards for solid foundation in Russia's history and Russia's empire building and Russia's authoritarianism, stepping background to try to backwards to find a solid footing, because after the 1990s, Russia was a place of chaos, and it felt like, maybe stepping back to that solid foundation of authoritarianism, which you have something, You know, some sort of organization, some sort of structure is better than the chaos of the 90s, jumping into the unknown. And you can understand that appeal, but that type of view of Vladimir Putin as just an authoritarian who has control after the chaos of the 90s, and he's like any other authoritarian. He's a thug. He just cares about money and power. This removes the ideology out of what motivates Vladimir Putin, what motivates the rest of the Russian elite, the Siloviki, what motivates those in his inner circle. To try to pretend that these people don't believe anything is nonsensical when they've been telling us what they believe pretty consistently since the start of the invasion. At the start of it, Vladimir Putin came out and made a speech and said the borders of the post-Soviet states are artificial, which is a pretty good foundation to lay before saying something like Russia's borders have no end. You know, Russia's borders end nowhere. So if the borders of nations like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Ukraine are artificial, and Russia's borders have no end, what does that seem to be setting up? What does that seem to be spelling out about Russia, what Russia can and what Russia should do, especially as the Putin regime paints this as a civilizational struggle? Point is, this is not just a question of, oh, Putin is like a thug authoritarian who wants to enrich himself like some mafioso with no ideology. He has an ideology. And that ideology is the Russian idea. Russia's unique place in history to fight back against degeneracy and to guide Europe forward and to be an empire. And that Russia must, which has been said by many of Putin's colleagues and many of the historians that he respects, that it must be an empire. That Russia cannot exist outside of being an empire, which has been asserted by people on both state media and people who ideologically align themselves with Putin. My main point here is that we need to stop looking at Putin like, oh, this is just some like mafioso dictator who just wants to enrich himself. This is like Idi Amin, or this is some other like just gouging off themselves, just wants to enrich himself and his cronies. That's all there is to it. There is an ideology here. He said at the start of the war, when he laid out his reason for invading, which economically was not the smartest decision, at least for the short term and for the business class, if it was just about enriching himself, where Russia has over $300 billion in foreign reserve currency frozen. Their government revenues have been cut in half. They have only been able to make up 1/8 of the oil and gas sales that they made to Europe through India and China. So it doesn't seem like it was just for profiteering, or there must be something else there. And that's where the ideology is. And that's why I think I find so much difficulty in talking to leftists sometimes about this, is because I feel like a lot of people look at the world through a purely materialist lens, and then therefore they assume everybody else is maybe either looking through that lens or is analyzing through that world through maybe not the same materialist lens as you, maybe on the other end of the materialist lens as the bourgeoisie, but through that same lens. And I feel like it's been difficult for me to put upon people that, there might be an underlying ideology here, and it isn't just John Mearsheimer realism, like, oh, it's all just a big chessboard, but also that he believes that Russia genuinely deserves Ukraine and it's theirs, and that Russia has a right to an empire. And look, I think some people might say, Dylan, you're reading a lot into this. Okay, so what if all those philosophers and historians and all those other people said that this is the basis for that? This is one sign. One sign. Who can, like, it's one, like, okay, one journalist went out of their way to find a sign that looked kind of bad, and now you're gonna make all this hubbub about it. What of it? It's not just one sign. It's here. It's here. It's here. And it's here. It is not a narrative that is just dropped out of the sky, and this is just like a one-off instance. This is something I've seen on Russian state TV. This is something that is actively promoted and paid for to be promoted by the Russian government. This is something that the Russian government is working to prepare its people for. They are preparing their people for a civilizational struggle. They are preparing their people for the borders to end nowhere. They're preparing their people for new regions to be added to Russia. as they did in Crimea, as they did in Donetsk, as they did in Luhansk, as they did in Zaporozhye, and as they did in Kherson, and as they would do in Odessa if they could get their hands on it, as they would do in Kharkiv if they could get their hands on it there, and as they would do anywhere else they can get their hands on. When somebody tells you who they are, you should believe them. This right here, this type of language is why I'm not just going to accept some ceasefire in and of itself to bring about peace and tranquility. Because we can see what they're saying in advance. You need something strong to deter. You need something real you can grab and you can hold on to that would stop the Russians from invading Ukraine again. You cannot just bet upon goodwill and us all, wanting to all live in peace and tranquility and kumbaya because we all believe the same things. We don't all believe the same things. We believe very different things when it comes to the future of Ukraine. That's why we have the war in the first place. The Ukrainians want to be their own country. The Russians want them to be part of their empire project. That's that.